Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to episode number 11 of History for Shut-ins. We will finish the Revolutionary War today as we talk about the battles of Kings Mountain, Cowpens, Guilford Courthouse, and Yorktown. And then we will also discuss the Treaty of Paris. You'll remember in History for Shut-ins episode number 10, it wasn't our exactly most favorite day as we talked about losses at the beginning of the Southern campaign for the British. The loss of Savannah, Augusta, Charleston. We also had the loss at Camden, South Carolina. But the silver lining in that loss is General Horatio Gates is replaced by Nathaniel Greene, who turns things around fairly quickly for the Patriots. So let's start with the Battle of Kings Mountain. It takes place on October 7th, 1780. It's a small but very significant battle. It takes place on a rocky hilltop in western South Carolina. It pitted loyalist militia elements under the command of British Major Patrick Ferguson, also known as Bulldog Ferguson, against 900 Patriot troops known as the Over Mountain Men. They were residents of the backcountry in the Carolinas and Appalachian Mountain Range, as well as the territories that later would become the states of Tennessee and Kentucky. Cornwallis, the British general, dispatches Ferguson in North Carolina in early September of 1780. Ferguson is given two tasks or two goals. He must recruit for the Loyalist militia. Remember, when the British came south, they were under the belief that there was heavy Loyalist support in the South. They are finding out as the Southern campaign moves forward that that is not true. By recruiting Loyalist militia, Ferguson is looking to protect Cornwallis's left flank as Cornwallis attempts to move through the Carolinas. Remember, when Clinton leaves Cornwallis after the Battle of Camden, he says, your big task is to keep South Carolina and, if possible, go into North Carolina, but do not do so if you are in danger of losing your hold on South Carolina. From the start, Ferguson completely miscalculates Patriot strength in the area. Several local Patriot militias drew up plans to take on Ferguson. Again, this is very much like what happens at the Battle of Bunker Hill, is you have militia units coming in from all over, from surrounding territories and states. Learning of these various state militias or local Patriot militias coming in, Ferguson opts to retreat from his forward position and pulls back to the main body of the British Army with Cornwallis. Cornwallis, to say the least, is not happy. Rather than generate support, additional support, what Ferguson does is he actually increases the resentment among the Over Mountain Men because of what he's done here. As he retreats, Ferguson is shadowed by the Over Mountain Men themselves. He chose to dig in, Ferguson does, and fortify a small 60-foot hill 2 miles inside the South Carolina border. A scouting party from the Colonial Army, from the Patriots, from the Over Mountain Men, learn of Ferguson's position, giving militia commanders the information. The Patriot plan was simple: assault the hill from all sides, come from every side possible. Early on the afternoon of October 7th, the Over Mountain Men moved quietly towards Ferguson's position. When the first shots ring out, the Patriots attack from all sides. really putting Ferguson in a pickle. Ferguson deploys his loyalist militia in the center of the hilltop. He led the counterattack against surging Patriot troops from the southwest. Initially, Ferguson's men, after they fire a volley and fix bayonets, blunt or stop the Over Mountain men's advance. But that was on one side of the hill. The Over Mountain men continued basically unopposed from the other sides, I should say, of the hill, of the mountain, using the woods for cover. Ferguson and his men are surrounded. Other counterattacks by Ferguson fail to stop the Patriot Over Mountain men. The Over Mountain men, as they are attacking and gaining ground, start yelling. What are they doing? The Over Mountain men, is this the first example of the rebel yell? In a respect, I think so, perhaps. With his defensive perimeter shrinking, Ferguson tries to lead his men past the Over Mountain men. Mounted on his horse, he is an absolutely perfect target. Remember, during these times, it was considered ungentlemanly to shoot and kill a commander, an officer. The British did not do it. The Americans were happy to do it. So what happens here? Ferguson is shot numerous times. His body is dragged as he is still mounted on his horse and fleeing the battle. The horse is running from the battle. After Ferguson's death, the Loyalist militia surrenders. Total killed in action, total Loyalists killed in action, anywhere from 150 to almost 300, with as many POWs, prisoners of war. The Over Mountain men lose 30 total. Kings Mountain is a stinging defeat, and think of it, after the sieges of Savannah and Augusta and Charleston and the loss at Camden, Kings Mountain is a desperately needed victory, one, to stop the British advance, at least for a little time, and then two, to raise Patriot morale. Their banking, or one of the lessons of Kings Mountain, is that the British cannot bank on Loyalist support moving forward. Next up is the Battle of Cowpens. It's an example of superb military prowess and leadership, skilled leadership. It's a battle near Chesney, South Carolina, and is another key Patriot victory. The Patriots demonstrate their skill on the morning of the 17th of January, 1781. We are now less than a year away from the Battle of Yorktown. Initially, as we've said, the Southern campaign was a success for the British. They gained easy victories in conventional battles early in the campaign over very ill-equipped and poorly led Patriot troops. By freeing Southern planters' greatest source of labor and income, slaves, the British did not find many in the South who were sympathetic to their cause. With little Loyalist support, the British face increasing challenges in battle as this Southern campaign progresses. After the American loss at Camden, Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton from Great Britain aggressively pursues Daniel Morgan's forces through South Carolina. Morgan has been fighting throughout the colonies during the Revolution. Remember, he's got a crack troop of about 500 crack shot riflemen. Tarleton chases Morgan's men without full knowledge of how many men Morgan actually has. Knowing, on the other side of the coin, Morgan knows what Tarleton has, where he's located, So Morgan readies his almost 1,100 men for battle. On the morning of January 17th, Morgan's men met the British on wide open pastures. There's no cover whatsoever. Kept clear by cattle grazing, this allows Morgan's swift military maneuvering of his troops. Rolling hills served Morgan in deceiving Tarleton that he could secure a very easy victory. Tarleton, that is, of course. Hoping to decrease any thought of retreat in his men, what Morgan does is he positions his forces between two rivers, the Broad and Pacolet rivers, ensuring that meeting the British was the only option for Morgan's troops. Morgan knew that these men could panic in the early stages of combat. He'd seen it time and time again. Not necessarily his men per se, but other militia regiments. Increased morale or greater morale in his men and fostering confidence, having them positioned between the two rivers, Morgan has a chance against the more disciplined and better trained British troops. Betting Tarleton would employ typical British field battle tactics by lining up his men linearly, in lines basically. Morgan left his flanks open, basically inviting the British to take the bait. On a small hill in the center of the line, Morgan placed his troops that were from Maryland and Delaware, and made his defense in three separate lines. In the first line, he has skirmishers. In the second line, he has militia. And his last line of defense are his best trained troops. So really, it's almost like a graduated level of experience. Skirmishers, militia, and then his, army troops, if you will. Morgan ordered some of the trained men to be in the first two of the three lines and shoot at British officers first. His thought was, if you cut off the head of the snake, then the rest of the troops are going to be disorganized and they're not going to know what to do here. As the British advanced, Morgan ordered militia in the second line to fire two volleys and then immediately retire to the rear line to reorganize and fight in reserve behind the line of Continental Army men and alongside horsemen who were posted in the rear as well. The maneuver would give the appearance that the Patriots were retreating and would draw Tarleton in even further. What it would also do is Tarleton would then, or not what Tarleton would do, it would conceal Morgan's third line, which would have the high ground. Remember, these are open pastures, and it would allow his men on the high ground to fire into the British as they advanced to assault the hill. The British took heavy casualties in the initial attack to clear out the skirmishers and take on the militia. So basically, Morgan's first two lines of defense. By the time they reached the third line of more experienced colonial troops, the British troops are in complete disorganized chaos. Their other issue, they are depleted of officers because that's who Morgan's men have been shooting. Tarleton's men try to press their advantage, but they're basically leaderless. An hour into the fighting, elements of Morgan's Virginia regiments fired point blank as the British attempted a very weak flanking move on the right, which is what Morgan wants them to do. At the point that the British assault was stopped, the colonial troops fixed bayonets. In the ensuing melee, the colonial sees the two small British field pieces that the British brought for artillery support. The British line is melting away as their regulars are surrendering. The U.S. cavalry, which is now part of that third line and behind the third line, moves forward from behind the third line and envelops the British to cut them off from retreating. The shock of the sudden American movements completely devastate the left side of the British line. Morgan orders 100 cavalrymen under William Washington. Yes, he is related to George. He is George's second cousin once removed. William Washington is ordered to meet Tarleton's men at the third line. Washington's horsemen attacked on the right. You then have reformed militia who had, remember, they retreated to the third line. They come back into the fight after they've reorganized. So that reformed line comes back into the fight. And what are they doing? They are absolutely hitting the British everywhere, overwhelming them completely. Any British officer and soldier who could get the heck out of Dodge did, but there weren't very many. Tarleton shot William Washington's horse out from under him and leaves. That's basically the last shot of the battle. The entire battle is over by 8 in the morning. Not bad. The defeat of the British further thwarts their attempts to take control of the southern colonies from the U.S., and it demoralizes what loyalist support they do have, who were counting on the British to maintain a stiff defense against the colonial troops. Next, Guilford Courthouse. This takes place on the morning of March 15th, 1781. So again, we're now about 6-7 months out from Yorktown. The British have a force of 2,100. They find colonial forces holding a defensible position on elevated ground. The British front faced a plantation with a large field on both sides of the road, with 2 more fields further on the left, separated by 200 yards of wooded land or woods. To the British right, woods go on for miles, for several miles. On the far side of the first field was a fenced wood, 1 mile deep, through which the road passed into an extensive cleared area around Guilford Courthouse. Along the edge of this wood was a fence forming the U.S. first line of defense and a 6-pound cannon on each side of the road. The colonial troops are basically using the fence. Remember, the British think it's ungentlemanly also to be behind a fence, behind a wall, in a house, behind a tree. You have to be out in the open. Colonial troops are using this fence to rest their muskets and fire, giving them steadier aim, and of course giving them some cover. Nathaniel Greene is on the scene. His defense consists of 3 lines of 4,500 men. So basically, he's got a little bit more than twice the troop size of the British, and he's also got the high ground. His first line was held by the South Carolina Militia. On their flanks, backwoods riflemen used to snipe at the British as they advanced across the field of battle. In the second line, you have Virginia militia. So again, it's very similar to Kings Mountain, or Cowpens, in which Morgan had those 3 lines of defense. Nathaniel Greene is copying that. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. So again, in the second line, Greene's got Virginia militia, so slightly more experienced than skirmishers. The militia were supported by artillery near their center. Battle-tested units of Virginia Regiment Delaware Infantry, and 1st and 2nd Maryland regiments complete the third line. These are his most experienced troops on the field, and it's his most formidable line. These troops were placed on an angle facing the road. At 1:30 in the afternoon, Cornwallis launched his attack up the west side of the road after an initial artillery barrage. As Cornwallis's troops got within 150 yards of the fence line, the Americans fire a volley. The British keep moving forward, returning fire only when they got within range of Colonial guns. The British surged forward only to be scattered by elements of a North Carolina militia posted along the picket fence. The British continued to advance. North Carolina militia fire another volley, and true to form, as militia did during battle, once they fire a volley, they retreat to the rear of the defenses. So they're actually running back into the woods. To the British, the militia retreat looks like a rout, as the militia are also throwing down their guns and equipment. The British assault gets to the second line, which, remember, is more experienced militia, much stiffer resistance. The British tried to flank the second line, and what happens when they do that? They hit Greene's best troops. In breaking through the first two lines of defense by the Colonials, the British sustained very heavy casualties. On the British right flank, the Colonial cavalry commander, say that 3 times fast, is Light Horse Harry Lee and his mounted troops. What do? They are able to engage Hessians who are fighting with the British as well as the British, keeping them from making any sort of measurable contribution to the battle. British artillery and light dragoons, led by Tarleton, he's back, try to keep pace with the British that move forward in front of them. Open ground faced the British in the vicinity of the courthouse. Immediately facing them are Greene's most experienced troops, a large contingent of the Colonial Army. The British attack. They captured 2 6-pound cannons. As the British forced the American troops back into the woods, William Washington's troops counterattack, and they stop the British advance. Cornwallis orders forward his battery of guns, directing his officers to fire on William Washington's men and British troops who are in this large open area. Friendly fire kills many of the British troops as Nathaniel Greene orders his men to break off the counterattack and leave the field. It was a very dear-fought victory, and given his casualties and his lack of supplies, or supplies that were lost, Cornwallis says, the heck with the Carolinas, I'm going to head for the Virginia coast, where I will be reinforced and resupplied. This is what sets the table for Yorktown. So, the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, technically a British victory, but they pay a very big price for it. So let's move to Yorktown. So our good friend, well, maybe not, Cornwallis has his back to the York River. He intends to resupply his 9,000-man army in the fall of 1781. George Washington sees an opportunity. He's got an army of 20,000, reinforced by several thousand French troops under Rochambeau. What does Washington decide to do with these Allied troops? He says, I'm going to siege, I'm going to turn the tables, much like the British laid siege to Charleston and Augusta and Savannah, we're going to turn the table and do it to them. After a very grueling forced march from New York, Allied forces arrived near Yorktown on September 28th and immediately began the siege. Cornwallis had thrown up a series of redoubts on the outskirts of Yorktown, while the majority of his men hunkered down inside the town itself. When Allied forces arrive at Yorktown, the French forces secure the left flank, while colonial forces secure the right flank. The British Navy intended to sail up the Chesapeake Bay to provide supplies and reinforcements. However, no aid materialized. On the 5th of September, British aid and the resupply fleet were met by French warships at the Battle of the Capes. The British were badly defeated and forced to abandon their brethren at Yorktown. Cornwallis is trapped. It's just a matter of time until the vice is squeezed and Cornwallis is done. With the help of French engineers, colonial and French troops begin to dig a series of parallel trenches which brought troops and artillery close enough to inflict damage on Cornwallis and his troops. Working around the clock, Allied soldiers used spades and axes to create a perimeter line of trenches that would eventually encircle the British. British deserters are telling the Allies that morale inside Yorktown is at rock bottom. The British futilely try to disrupt any Allied operations by using what little artillery they have left. It does not have a great effect. On the 7th of September, Allied lines were within musket range of the British, so they're getting closer and closer and closer. On the 9th of October, Allied artillery were in place. On the afternoon of the 9th, Allied artillery barrages begin, with the French firing the opening salvo. Washington is given the honor of touching off the first colonial cannon. Colonial artillery consists of 14 guns. For almost a week, the barrage goes on without end, around the clock. Deliberately firing all night, Washington's forces pound the British to prevent them from repairing any damages that are incurred. On the 11th of October, Washington orders a second parallel to be dug 400 yards closer to the British lines. The British have two redoubts 9 and 10, that prevented the second parallel from being dug to the river. The British were still able to reinforce the garrisons inside the redoubts, but they're running out of supplies. They would have to be taken by force. A new line was in place by the morning of October 12th. On the evening of the 14th, after endless artillery barrages to weaken their defenses, Allied forces assaulted redoubts 9 and 10. Washington chose to launch the attack on a moonless night, which would, of course, add to the element of surprise. Soldiers were told not to load or prime their weapons so that the British wouldn't be alerted. The password for the onslaught, for the assault, was Rochambeau, and of course the colonials thought it was Rush On, boys. That's how they translated it. The operation commenced with a diversionary attack, on a redoubt further to the north of Yorktown at 6:30 in the evening, giving the appearance that the town of Yorktown was going to be stormed. Then Alexander Hamilton's force, a detachment of about 400 light infantry, assault Redoubt number 10. To clear the way for the main body of Hamilton's attack, sappers are ordered to remove wooden obstacles that the British had placed on forward slopes of the redoubt. To prevent British defenders from escaping, Hamilton dispatches troops under Lieutenant Colonel John Lawrence to cover the rear of the redoubt. As colonial troops hacked at the various abatis and trees and whatnot with axes, the British know that something is up. A British sentry fires down into the U.S. lines, and the colonials assault that fortification, climbing over the parapet into the redoubt. Serious fighting ensues in close quarters. So you've got hand-to-hand fighting going on. The British are overwhelmed. It is a stunning victory for the Americans and the French, with Allied forces only losing 34. The French, while Hamilton is assaulting Redoubt 10, the French are assaulting Redoubt 9. After a fierce firefight, they take control of the position from the British. Cornwallis's position is completely untenable, as the Allies have artillery on three sides, and they're blowing them to bits. New pieces, artillery pieces, are being positioned in redoubts 9 and 10, which have been overtaken by the Americans and by the French, respectively. In a last-ditch effort, Cornwallis orders a futile counterattack on the 15th of October. On the 17th of October, in the morning, a lone British drummer boy beating parley and a British officer waving a white handkerchief tied to the end of his sword are seen on a parapet at the forward position of the British lines. Blindfolded and brought inside American lines, the British officer secures terms of surrender. Washington wanted Cornwallis to surrender his sword to him. Cornwallis sent out a subordinate to do it. On the 19th of October, in a field outside Yorktown, the surrender took place as British troops and Hessians, with their flags furled and cased, marched between contingents of colonial and French forces. The British wanted more honorable terms, but Washington, remembering what happened at Charleston a year earlier when Ben Lincoln asked for similar terms and was refused, is now turning the tables on the British. Legend has it that a British band played the nursery rhyme or nursery tune, "The World Turned Upside Down," which I have attached a YouTube link for on the web, on my page here. In 1783, the British would abandon New York City. So this is 1781, they surrender. It's another almost 2 years, not quite, before they abandon New York City, and Washington's forces victoriously enter New York City. The war is over, and the United States is born, which is the flag behind us here. This is the first U.S. flag with the United States as a nation. 13 stars, 13 stripes. So the Treaty of Paris, or what's also called the Paris Peace, it's a collection of treaties signed between the British, the French, the Americans, and the Spanish. Preliminary articles were signed at Paris between the British and the Americans on November 30th of 1782. These are often called the preliminary Treaty of Paris. On September 3rd, 1783, three distinct treaties are signed, one between the United States and the British in Paris. This is the Treaty of Paris. There was one signed between the British and French and Spain, respectively, at Versailles. The Netherlands and Great Britain also signed a preliminary treaty on September 2nd, 1783, and there is a final peace on May 20th, 1784. The terms of the British and American treaty were that the British recognized United States independence with pretty generous boundaries, unless you were a Native American, of course, to the Mississippi River, but the British said we will retain Canada. Access to Newfoundland fisheries was guaranteed to the United States, and navigation of the Mississippi River was to be open to both the British and the Americans. Think of the importance of the Mississippi River. We'll talk about that again when we discuss the Civil War. The other terms of the treaty between the British and the Americans: creditors of neither country were to be impeded in the collection of their debts, and Congress was to recommend to the states that loyalists be left unharmed, be treated fairly, that their confiscated property be restored. Several years in the future, Alexander Hamilton, one of the first cases he tries before the Supreme Court, the New York Supreme Court, or actually it's the U.S. Supreme Court, I'm sorry, he is actually defending a loyalist who lost her property and her business during the Revolutionary War. Some of these provisions that I've just mentioned were to cause difficulties and disputes in later years, and actually are still a bone of contention when the War of 1812 starts. To France, the British surrendered Tobago and Senegal. Spain retains Minorca and East and West Florida on the North American mainland. The Netherlands does not sign a very good treaty. They cede a port city in India by the name of Nagapattinam. And I said it slow because I didn't want to butcher it. Nagapattinam. They also allowed the British free navigation rights in the Dutch-held Moluccas. So this is where we will end the Revolutionary War. The good guys win. What I am going to do on Monday, and what I'm thinking about doing here, is just moving forward with U.S. history. I think the next topic we'll cover will be the Continental Congress and the Constitution, and then we'll work our way through several of the presidents. If anybody has any questions while watching the taped or live presentation, please feel free to leave a question, and I will answer it on the site here. I also have a History for Shut-ins YouTube channel. If you go to YouTube and type in History for Shut-ins, you will see every episode. I thanked several libraries yesterday. Today, I want to thank the Royal Oak Public Library in Royal Oak, Michigan, for sharing information on History for Shut-ins. Thank you to everybody who joined. Have a great weekend, and I will see you Monday, the 6th of April at 5 p.m. We will talk about the Constitutional Convention. Thanks so much. Take care.